Thank you all for coming. If you're at the previous lecture, I'm afraid this is the dying fall after the excitement that you've just seen some lovely goodies. As you all know by now, the Hobbit is at 80 this weekend. I've been a bit vague on that because I wasn't sure what day I'd be giving this lecture when I originally wrote it out. So, the Hobbit's 80 as yesterday, but Tolkien's use of the word could be 87 years old, although he may have encountered it earlier. So most of the content of this paper was originally published by the Journal of Tolkien Research under the title Hobbits and What May They Be. This is something that's taken me by surprise because it wasn't something I was expecting to write about, but I'll go through that story later on. Have we got any Welsh speakers present?
Not Welsh speakers, but Welsh.
Welsh. Right. I'd like to apologise.
Yes,
especially for the next bit. I was looking for, I know it's an international meeting, looking for an appropriate map of Wales to illustrate this. This appeared on the internet in the last month. This was in an Oxford University student's book that the libraries in Oxford have published, all the marginalia recently as a joke. I think it was originally a few years ago, but obviously somebody who was a bit disgruntled with Wales. All I can think of, it must be someone from East Anglia who is used to big skies. I will show some better maps of Wales as we go along. But at the very outset, I'd just like to say that I must emphasise that Tolkien's use of the word Hobbit could very well be a genuine coinage, made up on the spur of the moment as he scrawled some words on the back of an exam paper. However, if he had encountered the word before, what is the most likely source? What follows is speculation, but hopefully more convincing than the currently favoured explanation. Right, this is the start of the quest. 2 summers ago, I went to my local university library. I was looking for original reviews of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings as they appeared in periodicals. I typed in Hobbit as a search word in the listener, which is only available to universities, I think, when this came up, which rather took me back. Will you kindly arrange for me, as you did last year and the year before, with your tenant, who has the good potatoes, that he, or such other of them as may have the best, should send me 12 hobbits. They say the measure is extinct by law, but I like the old hobbit notwithstanding, when he gets them up. As you can imagine, that was a really strange thing to suddenly come across. So I put it on the Tolkien Society Facebook page just to see what reaction there would be. You see a bit more of the letter there. You can see the address of the recipient, and it's clearly Abergele. I might need some help with some of these Welsh pronunciations. And also it's interesting that the next paragraph there's a Dr. Buckland mentioned, and he was one of the chief antiquarians, as they called them at the time. And the letter itself, it doesn't say that on there. The letter was written by Sir Thomas Brown with an E on the end, and he was another leading antiquarian. So obviously this letter, which was in the listener in 1933, it was reprinting a letter originally written in 1836. So obviously the Hobbit meant something else before Tolkien used it. This is how we originally think of Tolkien. He's related it many times, that he scribbled down the sentence on an exam paper because there was a blank page. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. and he describes it himself as the actual flashpoint, as if it just came to him like that. And here's a few examples of explanations to different people, and they're more or less very, very similar. In his 1955 letter to W.H. Auden, I did not and do not know why he wrote that sentence on the back of the exam paper. And in the 1968 TV interview, Tolkien in Oxford, he said, I can't think why. The same year, the 1968 Telegraph magazine, interviewed by the Plymouth, which Alan may have shown, was that on display? I know this was Sunday Times one.
That wasn't one of them.
Right.
Not without you.
I don't know where the word Hobbit came from. But I'd also like to emphasise something else in that sentence. People concentrate on the word Hobbit, but I'd like to emphasise in a hole in the ground there lived a Hobbit, because this other meaning of the word is associated with the ground. So at the moment of inspiration of writing that sentence, hobbits are associated with holes in the ground and by implication with the soil. Now, a lot of you will have heard this phrase before, the leaf mould. When answering a question about the origin of the word Gondor, Tolkien mentioned, one's mind is, of course, stored with a leaf mould of memories of names, and these rise up to the surface at times and may provide, with modification, the basis of invented names. So I've stressed with modification because I hope to come back to that later. And in a similar letter to Roger Lancelyn Green, when discussing the origin of the word Hobbit, he confided, one cannot exclude the possibility that childhood memories might suddenly rise to the surface long after, in my case, after 35 to 40 years, though they might be quite differently applied. And it's the quite differently applied that I'd like to stress at the outset. Now, Tolkien was bothered where the word came from very early on. This is just a fraction of a letter he wrote in reply to someone in 1938 calling themselves Hobbit, asking if he'd found the word in an old children's story when the Hobbit in the story was quite frightening, but also asking if it could be a story from an African explorer, which the writer thought might have had fairy pygmies called hobbits. No such story has so far, as far as I'm aware, been traced. And then in 1977, so the same year that the Silmarillion was published, the Times announced it cracked the where Tolkien didn't suddenly think up the word. He read it years before. There is an existing creature called Hobbit, and Tolkien had simply used the name. And ever since then, when anyone's discussing the origin of the word Hobbit, they seem to feel as though they have to take this into consideration. The Times had quite a good reputation in 1977, pre-Rupert Murdoch. So the Times revealed that a researcher had found the word Hobbit in a book published in the 19th century, now known as the Denham Tracts. They were edited by Michael Aisleby Denham, and the actual original publication date has now been found to be 1853, but at the time it was just known in sometime in the 19th century. And hobbits are included in a long list of supernatural species of spirits just before hobgoblins, but no further details are included. This is, you'll have seen this is from the annotated Hobbit, and you can see on the third line down, hobbits followed by hobgoblins. Denham produced several of these little, they were very ephemeral pamphlets, and he kept updating them every few years. And more or less they were the same, but early ones than 1853 didn't include the word hobbits. And suddenly in 1853 the word hobbits appeared, but nobody at the moment knows where he got it from. So the Denham Tracts, they're a very obscure book of folklore and ephemera, collected together by Michael Ainsley Denham early in the 19th century and later edited into a more lasting book form by James Hardy, and it was him that gave them the title the Denham Tracts. And that's what the Denham Tracts is, the name that keeps getting bandied about when people are talking about the origin of the word hobbit. So as I've mentioned, they've looked at different versions and they noticed the one in 1853 that hobbit was used for the first time. Now, a lot of the top scholars who have talked about the origin of the word hobbit have felt they've got to take the Denham Tracts into account. Tom Shippey said there was slender evidence that they were the true origin of Tolkien's word hobbit. Marjorie Burns said there was no evidence Tolkien ever read the Denham Tracts. In the Ring of Words, more recently, they think if Tolkien had used another word on that long list, which was unique to the Denham Tracts and found nowhere else, then the theory would have more credibility. But they think the Denham Tracts, it's such an obscure publication that it certainly seems an unlikely source for buried childhood memories. John Ratliff analyses or talks about the word hobbit in a 13-page analysis in the appendix to the history of the Hobbit, and right at the end he concludes that the Denham Tracts were highly unlikely as a source. So everyone keeps saying how unlikely they are, but this weekend, what did The Guardian do when they were talking about the 80th birthday of The Hobbit? They did mention this story again, so it comes up all the time. Now I contend that the Denham Tracts have attracted most attention because it contains the name of a creature with the same name as Tolkien's. There are other uses of the word, but because they're not a creature, people, especially journalists, just can't seem to get their head around an idea that he might have used a word that had a slightly different meaning. They think it had to be a creature, and once that article appeared in the Times, that was it, QED, the Hobbit came from the Denham Tracts. But I hope by the end of this I'll have sown a seed of doubt. I just want to remind you again that when Tolkien suggested that he may have resurrected a half-buried memory to create a word like hobbit, he also added a significant qualification that any childhood memories might be quite differently applied. A previous, very obscure example of a hobbit creature is not a different application. Right, did the word hobbit exist before the Denham Tracts? So, 1853, we need to see if we can find it before 1853. John Ratliff, rather foolishly, said the Denham Tracts contains the only known occurrence of the word hobbit before Tolkien. However, on the 11th of February 1796, a Flintshire magistrate wrote a letter to his local paper which referred to a man who sent a load of 21 hobbits, which would be pronounced the same really, of barley to a kiln in the town. A hobbit, or hobbits, was defined as a measure of 2.5 bushels or 4 pecks, which represented 147 pounds of barley, 168 pounds of wheat, 105 pounds of oats, and 180 pounds of vetches, clover and beans. To go back even further, the Welsh equivalent of the OED, and this is where a Welsh speaker would be handy. I think I'll just call it the GPC. I've dubbed that one. Trace the term back as far as the late medieval works of Dafydd ap Edmund, which is several centuries before it appeared in English. Then we have the letter that you've already seen. Will you kindly arrange for me, as you did last year and the year before, with your tenant, who has the good potatoes, that he, or such other of them as may have the best, should send me 12 hobbits. They say the measure is extinct by law, but I like the old hobbit, notwithstanding, when he gets them up. And there's a little bit closer, so you can see that letter was written on the 5th of October 1836. Now, the listener published it in 1933, and the reason for that was this letter was found in a book in St Asaph Cathedral near Abergele, and it was reprinted in full because the writer to the listener wanted to, it was the 4th paragraph he was interested in, about, it seemed as if someone was almost inventing the radio back in 1836, and the listener was for radio listeners, wireless listeners as they would be known at the time. And luckily, this could so easily have been lost. That paragraph was included, instead of just including the paragraph about the almost someone predicting the invention of the radio, they included this strange paragraph about potatoes and hobbits. So the recipient of the letter was a Welshman living in Coed Coch near Abergele, which is on the north coast of Wales, between Rhyl and Colwyn Bay. And I can show you on a map. So the dip in the centre there's Abergele, and there's St Asaph, where the letter was found in 1933. So still on the tack of did the word hobbit exist before the Denham tracts? I've gone through the Wrexham Advertiser, and the word is used every week between the 18th of January and the 25th of April 1896. Well, in the 3 years between 1897 and 1900, the North Wales Times, published in Denbigh, Clwyd, printed the word hobbit with the E more than 161 times in that short period. It's commonly used in areas around Mull, Denbigh and Rhyl. So some of the places, this is a modern map, but you can see, let's have a look. This is somewhere that will be mentioned later on. As Carnarvonshire will be. There's Mold and Ruthin. So these where local papers were published, and the arrow at the top, that's where Abergele is. So it's the area of North Wales. There's and Wrexham, which I've already mentioned as well. But was it known outside North Wales? So the South Wales Daily News reported in 1896 that potatoes are rotting in the ground and can be bought for 3 shillings a hobbit in 1896. So we're getting near to 1900 now. Tolkien would be 4 when that was published. So I'm not saying he read in the South Wales Daily News when he was 4. But it was still in use, the word was still being used. In the Hampshire Advertiser in 1842, so back in time, good quality barley sold as low as 14 shillings 6 pence a hobbit at a market in Fifth one?
Kelly.
Kelly. Oh, it's lovely, yeah. I'm beginning to understand why Tolkien liked Welsh. Someone did musical one.
I can say it again.
Might do something to my knees, better not. Even as local as Oxford, in 1867, in an article about raising chickens raised on barley, the writer said the cost of the barley was between 8 and 10 shillings a hobbit. The Cheshire Observer mentioned Hobbit 9 times on the same page in 1870. This is the page. Now, I've had to I've left off the 9th one because it was right down here, so you wouldn't be able to make it out. It'd be too small. We can just see. So that was a Cheshire advertiser. So outside Wales. So the word was known. And it's also mentioned multiple times in the Shrewsbury Chronicle and the Bradford Observer. The Belfast Newsletter pointed out discrepancies in the Hobbit measure in various parts of Wales. At Porthefley, it was the equivalent of £252, but in Wrexham it was only £168. That was in May 1864. So this is why court cases were coming up, because it was somebody would buy thinking they were buying at one measure and they were getting a different measure, so they were getting swindled. So that's why the word Hobbit kept appearing in papers. So the Northern Whig and Belfast Post mentioned Hobbit in an article about standardisation of agricultural measures as recently as 1921. So it was still being held up as an example, although it wasn't appearing in local papers to quite the same degree by then. So I contend that these examples that show that the use of the word Hobbit there in specific circles, agricultural circles, was much more common than an esoteric word published in a very esoteric tract. So, did Tolkien go to Wales? Could he have encountered the word himself? In 1920, the Tolkiens visited the Welsh coast around the area of Tywyn, Llanbedrock, but he is unlikely to have heard it on this occasion when an adult, because he was a practicing philologist by then, and by that time the word had declined in use. So even though he was in the right sort of area, I'll just show you where that is. So it's that little bit that sticks out, that area around there. The word wasn't being used so much, and I think if Tolkien had heard it then, as an adult, interested in words, I think he would remember it later when he reused the word. It has been claimed that Father Francis Morgan regularly took the young Tolkien and his brother on vacations in Wales. Now the evidence is very slim. I've only been able to find about one journey, but it is possible they might have spent more than one summer in Wales. Most of you probably have come across this before as well. Tolkien mentioned that he was first attracted to the Welsh language as a child when he saw Welsh names on coal trucks when he lived in the Midlands. Hammond and Skull date this to about 1900 or early 1901, unless their new book changes the date, of course. And Carpenter says that later in childhood he went on a railway journey to Wales, and as the station names flashed past him, he knew that here were words more appealing to him than any he had yet encountered. But I've asked at the Bodleian Library, and I'm afraid there is nothing about these childhood holidays to Wales in the Bodleian. So he didn't send anybody a postcard. Carpenter seems to have conflated his information from an interview Tolkien gave for the Sunday Times in 1967, and comments that Tolkien gave himself in the essay/lecture English and Welsh. Tolkien said, as a small boy, I remember going on the train to Wales and seeing the name
Ebu.
Ebu. Oh gosh. Right, thanks.
Ebu.
Thank you very much. I couldn't get over it. Not long afterwards, I started inventing my own languages. Ebu is a word found in the very south of Wales, as far as I've been able to find out. So I'm thinking that Tolkien and his brother and Father Morgan would catch the train bearing New Street, and I think they would come on this route here. And here is the position of Ebervale. That's on the far left-hand side. And there are reasons for, because he mentions Ebu, so we know that he's likely to have been in that area, but where exactly was Tolkien going? Carpenter doesn't give any clue as to date at all, but this journey would have taken place soon after Mabel Tolkien's death, when Tolkien was 12. He refers to himself as a small boy at the time. I know boys of 12 probably don't call themselves small now, but he probably did then. Father Morgan was proud to be distant related to the Morgans of Tredegar, thank you, near Newport, and they owned property in the south of Wales. I've got that information from Jose Manuel Fernandez Bru. I don't know if that's the Spanish. So this indicates that South Wales was most likely the destination, and it's very close to Ebu Vale. You probably saw it previously. Ebu Vale is up there, Newport there, and that's where the family house, the Tredegar house, is. So presumably somewhere in that area.
There are two Newports, so it may not be that one.
Ah.
There's
Tredegar
another
House.
one that's a holiday resort.
Tredegar House is there, South Wales, just off the M4.
Oh, right.
Yeah, just by
I
that.
think there may be a Tredegar Bay near the other Newport as well, so...
I have to double check that now.
If it's the Morgans, then that's the family home of the Morgans.
Oh yes, I've checked that. Yeah, it is the where the Morgans were.
Yeah.
So in North Wales, the word hobbit was in common use in agricultural circles, whilst in comparison, in South Wales, the word would have seemed more like a mere whisper or a rumour. You can imagine if, say, Tolkien had gone to North Wales at that time, in a local market there might have been chalked up prices per hobbit, people shouting out, buy a hobbit here. Whereas in the South Wales, it was definitely much harder to come across it. It was a very, you see, you might have overheard it distantly, but it wasn't at the forefront of agricultural life in the way it was in North Wales. So I think if Tolkien had visited North Wales, it would be so common up there, he would have remembered where he heard it. But in the south of Wales, it would be a lot less commonly encountered. There was also the faint possibility that Father Francis, who had Welsh connections in South Wales, going further back in time, could have referred fleetingly to the Welsh measure in conversation. Unfortunately, he died 2 years before The Hobbit was published. If he had lived, he would have no doubt received a copy of the book, and if he had known the word, he would have probably discussed it with Tolkien. It's a shame, really, that he died before it was published. So in either case, the word could have entered a child's unconscious or become submerged at that time, before it suddenly rose to the surface again when it was written on an exam paper 25 years later. In the letter to Roger Lansing Green, Tolkien made it clear when forgotten memory rose to the surface again, it might be quite differently applied. If this is what happened, it was transformed from a Welsh agricultural measure into an imaginary being half the size of an adult human, but was still with connections with the soil. In The Hobbit, nothing is said in the text itself, describing their agrarian lifestyle. Long digressions wouldn't have been appropriate in a children's story. You wouldn't want it, a gaffer shouting over the fence about farming in a children's book. Want to get on with it. But even though it wasn't explicit in the text, this is the picture that was the frontispiece to the first edition of The Hobbit in the UK. I don't know if you can make out, but there's an agricultural system of fairly small fields bounded in by either hedgerows or fences between Bag End and Hobbiton. It's a bit clearer here. The watercolour version was added to the second printing of 1937 and the first US edition, and you can quite clearly see there's different coloured crops. So hobbits obviously were involved in farming. When Tolkien very soon was asked to write a sequel, The New Hobbit as it was called at the time, straight away the connection with hobbits and the soil was made explicit in the text. In the fourth version, Bingo had always been very polite to Gaffer Gamgee, discussing potatoes with him over the hedge. That's in The Return of the Shadow. And in the plan forward of 1938, hobbits are fond of peace and quiet and good tilled earth, a well-ordered and well-farmed countryside is their natural haunt. Again, that's from The Shadow, Return of the Shadow. Shortly afterwards, Tolkien had originally planned to say that the hobbits had a kind of professional skill, aided by close friendship with the earth and all things that grow on it. In the published text, as we have it, in the matter of roots, especially potatoes, the gaffer was recognised as the leading authority by all in the neighbourhood. So there's plenty of examples of the hobbits being connected to the soil. And Sam Gamgee, of course, talks about taters, a vernacular name for potatoes, and then even refers to fish and chips, which seems anachronistic when you first read it. Well, it did for me anyway. So why did Tolkien emphasise the link between hobbits and potatoes, when hobbits was seen to be from an earlier epoch and potatoes are an import from the New World? Tom Shipley believes hobbits are inherently anachronistic in themselves and provide an indispensable bridge between a more ancient world Tolkien wants to describe and our own world. Tolkien himself said in the Dennis Geralt interview, hobbits are just rustic English people. It's only a small step from that to add that nothing could be more distinctively English, as Tom Shipley said, than mentioning their favourite national dish, fish and chips. Just some more examples of the hobbit being associated with the soil. In The Lord of the Rings, barley, the North Farthing barley was so fine that year, but the year of 1420 malt was long remembered and became a byword. So that's towards the end of Lord of the Rings. Corn is mentioned a few times. So at the beginning, when Frodo is preparing to leave the Shire, readers are informed that the corn was tall and full. And then when the ruffians occupy the Shire, the corn mills grind no more corn at all. But then everything is restored, and finally everywhere there was so much corn that at harvest every barn was stuffed. Corn or wheat, barley, oats and potatoes were all measured out in hobbits in North Wales throughout the 19th century. Could Tolkien have retained a vestigial remembrance from far back in his own past? There's also another possible link, so we'll just test that one out. This is someone who if you went to a lecture this morning, you may have heard about. This is Joseph Wright, Tolkien's mentor. Joseph Wright's English Dialect Dictionary. Of course, Wright was a mentor and teacher of Tolkien's and then became a family friend. Wright's book, EDD, has an entry on the Welsh noun hobbit, the meaning of which is given there. It is known that Tolkien would have used that book, but whether he went and looked up hobbit after he'd already written about it. Ian Spittlehouse kindly pointed out to me that in Elizabeth Wright's biography of her husband, there is an intriguing sentence. So you saw the books on the desk this morning, and this is a photograph of a couple of sentences. Towards the end of the page, most significant of all was the sight of dons and their wives tilling allotment gardens in the precious precincts of college meadows, and of septuagenarian scholars planting potatoes in the parks. Maybe I should draw your attention to the undergraduate element was represented by a few swarthy young men from distant climes. Because somebody might say, oh, that's where we got the Easterlings from, at the Glenor Fields. So that sentence that she uses there, about all being turned over to agriculture in Oxford. Now, if any of those septuagenarian dons were from the north of Wales, the word Hobbit may even have been bandied about in Oxford as Tolkien completed his degree. So rather tantalisingly, Tolkien could have come into contact with the word Hobbit from his friend and mentor's book. Now this is, when I was asked to prepare this by Dimitra Fimi, who saw the original Facebook on the Tolkien Society Facebook page, asked me to research it. I'd done a lot of work before I found out that someone had already considered this in myth lore. Discovered since that maybe myth lore isn't as well known among English scholars as it obviously is by American scholars. So he considered the entry in Joseph Wright's book, but when he was unable to locate any entries for hobbits in Welsh dictionaries, and the word seemed to have no obvious connection with Tolkien's hobbits, he moved on to other possible definitions. But he was wrong. In an 1815 English-Welsh dictionary, hobbade was defined as a peck of corn or meal in Glamorganshire, or 4 Winchester bushels in Carnarvonshire. So it was in Welsh dictionaries. Not the Welsh dictionaries he'd looked at, but then how common are Welsh dictionaries in America? Then it was revised again as recently as 2012, again in myth lore, and Livingstone went through all the definitions mentioned by O'Brien and added a couple of new ones. He also located Hobbit in a reference work, the Cyclopedia of Agriculture, 1863, by John Morton, which that book itself was used for 156 entries in the Oxford English Dictionary. And he also found that Charles Dickens had referred to the discrepancy between weights of hobbits in an 1863 editorial of his magazine All the Year Round, which had an impressive circulation. For example, the Christmas issues I attested to the ghost stories of Charles Dickens and other writers, and the All the Year Round had a circulation of 200,000 for the Christmas issues, which of course were passed round to the actual readership was even higher than that. And Livingstone discovered that in about 1600, a hobbit became a name for the measurement of land near Powys, mid-Wales. But that seems to have been a very temporary meaning. So both O'Brien and Livingstone seem to have shaken off the agricultural measure because they failed to realise just how widespread the term really was. None of them mention all these mentions in the newspapers, and the earlier one by O'Brien dismissed it very quickly. So I just have a personal feeling, but I feel that they were secretly hoping that they would find a definition of a hobbit which was a little bit more animate than a measure of grain or potatoes. I think people found it hard to think laterally, and they go with this, the Denham Tracts, because it is a creature, and of course Tolkien's Hobbit was a creature. So when that letter, which I quoted right at the beginning of the talk, was published in the Listener in September 1933, C.S. Lewis had fairly recently read an unpublished manuscript of which he said, I've had a delightful time reading a children's story Tolkien has just written. Whether it is really good, I think it is until the end, is of course another question, and it's thought that this book was The Hobbit. It's hardly likely that Lewis or Tolkien saw that letter in the listener. If they had, it is possible that Tolkien's submerged memories may have been fully reawakened. So just to conclude, the Welsh measure of a Hobbit could have reached Tolkien in two disparate ways, either as a child on holiday in Wales or as a young adult scholar. But of course, again, I must stress that he may just have made it up from his own imagination. But I think it's far more plausible that a long-forgotten agricultural measure encountered in childhood would be used rather than a single word from a long list of spirits in a rare book which we do not know he even looked at. So the next time, unfortunately the Guardian scuppered it, but maybe the next time after the Guardian, the origin of the word is discussed. I hope alongside the Denham Tracts theory, the obsolete Welsh measure also deserves a mention. Thank you very much. Any questions?
I was aware of this word. I couldn't have told you about it, but I recognise it. I knew the different spellings. The reason why is definitely through right or something of that sort. I associate it with what you call the Huddersfield dialect. Any reading I did about this was like 20, 25 years ago, so that's become a bit vague. But firstly, it's there, and I'm pretty sure right is the connection. Secondly, the Denham Tracts may be obscure, but the compiled book with Nin wasn't particularly obscure among folklore fans, of whom there were many in those days, not necessarily academic. I tried to find out at one point whether that was in the library at Leeds, but regrettably I can't remember what the answer was in the end.
So you didn't get a reply from them?
Sorry?
You did get a reply from Leeds?
I can't remember. I had a conversation with
Well,
somebody,
it might be worth me
I
chasing
was
it up,
academic
because
about it, I just phoned them up.
Right, it's just down the road from me, so I might be able to...
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you could find out, because if that compilation particularly is in there, it makes it much more likely that he actually read it, because he was interested in folklore. But I think, this is what I think, that probably I've written about this actually, the basic Hobbit thing came through the use of the word hob for the Brownies, which was fairly widespread. I mean, it's in Rudyard Kipling, it's in lots of places. Even the use of hobgoblin, which even Tolkien thought was a big goblin, it turns out to be a small goblin. So there you are, so he was getting that wrong. I think that's got something to do with it. Hobbit is a very obvious diminutive. I think he probably did read that compilation. I don't think he was thinking about that compilation when he made up the word. And I'm pretty sure he would have been, if this is it in the Huddersfield dialect or anything else he was working on, it would have been in his leaf mould. I don't think it's anything to do with his childhood. He would have been too young, in my view, having sort of tried to research old memories like this in my own experience. I think this is something that came out of his, as you say, young adulthood, probably through Leeds, through Yorkshire, is my view. And it's everything, because things feed into each other when you feed it back. If you get more than one source, it's more likely to come out of your memory.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
Just something to add to that. The other book that's interesting is Elizabeth Wright's books, which is rustic. I think it's called Rustic Lore and Folklore. And there's a whole chapter in there that talks about these types of creatures, and there is mention of hobbs and things like that. And we know Tolkien not only knew Joseph Wright, but he also knew Elizabeth Wright.
Yeah,
So there's something interesting, I think, in that book to be looked at
right.
as well.
Yeah, that's handy thing to... Yes, Denny.
A comment and a question. The first the comment is that if that connection with North Wales is validated, it means that now is a direct Tolkien connection with North Wales via his granddaughter Joan Baker, who for over 10 years, had a farm in Holywell, just next to Abergavenny.
Right, I didn't know that.
Okay, and the next one is this is a Welsh. It's a measure.
Yeah.
So we need to see the object that they use to measure that weight, which varies from place to place. There must be a physical container
It was
that
probably a
would
basket
vary
or
in
something.
size, and it may, for all that we know, be the size of an average hobbit, which would explain why they're so wide.
It's the same size as a Baggins.
Yeah. So somewhere, probably, presumably in Wales, there are physical objects, containers, buckets, tubs, tubby. Somebody who's tubby would be that would be called a hobbit, and then we may have a photo of it next year. Let's see if somebody does some research.
I'll have to go to Wales.
So, yeah.
Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.